Spanish flu. I hope the frozen ground would preserve the body along with the virus so that we could make a better flu vaccine, so we could test our drugs against history's deadliest disease. And my own story is the story of the 1918 flu. It's the story of the search, but it's also the story of the darker side of science. Double dealing and power games among the lords of science, and how scientific behavior deteriorates when the stakes are perceived as high. I did write a book based on my experiences because ultimately the world depends on science in order to look at emerging problems, whether it's bioterrorism and infectious disease, or to look for new cures or treatments for diseases such as multiple sclerosis. The other thing you should know about me is I have a cousin with MS. Strikingly beautiful, a former model. She went from active laughing to smiling to a quadriplegic in 4 years, while my family watched in horror. MS separated my cousin from her life. It separated her from society, from work, and from her family as speaking became more difficult. The first thing my family's experienced with MS is you look everywhere for some piece of evidence, some new research that will either slow the progression or stop it. And eventually you learn there is no help and there is no hope. Several years into her decline, we got the first lead. On leaving an MS clinic, we were quietly told, go to Italy for what would become the liberation procedure and go to Israel for stem cells. A year and a half later, so I've been watching this for a year and a half, a Canadian journalist covered Dr. Zamboni's research. And like thousands and thousands of Canadian families, we watched, who we cope with MS. And interesting theory, but I'm a scientist. I needed the evidence. And so I decided I would read all the literature, I would contact the experts, I would get the data, I would go to the conferences. But surprisingly and almost immediately, the Canadian and US MS societies were reticent to even consider the theory that, this was in conflict with traditional dogma. And I wondered what evidence they had collected. In February 2010, like Dr. Hubbard, I attended that conference in Canada. I am not a physician. I had to fight my way in, and interestingly, on the way upstairs, I met a cardiothoracic surgeon from Northern Ontario, Dr. Sandy McDonald. And when I went upstairs, I have to admit, I was skeptical, I was trepidatious. I needed the evidence, and the experts delivered with flow diagrams, MRIs, and I decided there's enough evidence here, I need to pursue this. Canada requires evidence-based medicine. That means in order to do diagnosis and treatment of CCSVI, there has to be clinical trials. So I decided to bring this fight to Parliament. Now, unfortunately, as in the US, there was a highly polarized debate. Did CCSVI cause MS? Does liberation cure it? The fundamental question should have been, do MS patients improve? Does their quality of life improve following liberation? And polarization has never helped patients. We've only to look at breast cancer and mammograms. And I wondered why, when MS drugs only reduce frequency or severity of attacks, why there was such a backlash against something that might improve quality of life, and for something that's been around for decades. On the one side in Canada, we have the neurologists. And this is a quote from one of them, that this is a hoax. And on the other side were the MS patients. And I want you to know, working with them has been one of the most humbling experiences of my life. They're courageous, they're tenacious, They should never have had to fight their disease and fight the system at the same time. So in May of 2010, my colleague, Dr. Bennett, and I wrote an open letter to our health minister asking for clinical trials in the registry in Canada. We were ignored. Then I asked for an emergency debate in Canada. We were ignored, but I was allowed. This got debated in Parliament for 4 hours. And I created this subcommittee on neurological disease, and I had the experts come. I had Dr. Zamboni, Dr. Simka, Dr. Hakey, who you'll hear from, Dr. McDonald. They all presented evidence. They said we absolutely need clinical trials. And this time, the experts were ignored. The government didn't budge. In the summer, I went to our high-ranking officials and said, why can't we have a registry? And I was astounded when they told me, because we don't know what's being done overseas. I said, well, that's not exactly true. I said, let me take Poland. Every patient sees a neurologist, has a Doppler, an eye test. There are pictures before and after the procedure, and there's actually video of the procedure, and you can see the blood refluxing to the brain. I was still ignored. Eventually, Canada put in place a political process, not a scientific process. They were going to have a joint meeting between the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, much like the NIH, and the MS Society, and they would look at CCSVI. Unfortunately, the panel, it was an expert panel with no experts. They hadn't done diagnosis or treatment of CCSVI. They didn't go to the international conferences. They didn't ask the experts. They didn't ask for their data, and they didn't visit labs or operating theaters. Instead, they looked at a handful of studies, 2 of which had been published in an astonishing 6 weeks. After that secret meeting, we were told that they didn't include experts for fear of biasing the sample. I think ignoring experts is a dangerous precedent. I wondered why there was such opposition to include people who might be seeing in a new way. Mind you, they included people who had spoken vehemently against this procedure, so people who are operating in traditional paradigms. Over the past year, I'm in touch with 1,000 MS patients across Canada. 300 of those have now been treated. Many have primary progressive and secondary progressive MS. I still get 3 and 4 personal emails a week, numerous telephone calls, and these are the changes and this is from a scientist. Improved circulation, changes in the color and temperature of the face, hands, and feet, a reduction in the searing nerve pain, the constrictive pain, it feels like someone's removed a tourniquet, reduction in brain fuzziness, improvement in motor function and vision and hearing. I thought you might like to hear 2 of those notes. And what you should know, I sort of picked the middle of the road notes, not the extraordinary notes. Better 3D vision, my left foot woke up, no longer numb. My balance is improved on the left side. I think the greatest gift, though, is sleep. Now I can sleep deeper, wake up, and go to work part-time. And I do not need to nap in the day. And I always appreciate the humor. I really enjoy those placebo effects. I'm busting at the seams to let everyone know. I will now be able to read books again, drop foot gone, fatigue gone. I walked the furthest I have walked in over 2 years, 2 days after the procedure. Balance is greatly improved. Benefits are priceless. The political process continues in Canada. We have a new scientific working group. Unfortunately, it suffers the same fatal flaws as the initial group. No experts, no experience, and many conflicts of interest. And they're going to look at the interim results of the 7 studies in Canada and the US, which is to look at whether CCSVI is related to MS. And I think we have good information from around the world.